I'm an attorney with CAIR-New York, the Council on American Islamic Relations New York chapter. As many of you know, CAIR is a leading Muslim civil rights organization that works on a range of legal advocacy and public education relating to discrimination targeting Muslim Americans. We're here today because this morning we, alongside CAIR National and the law firm of Dratel and Lewis, filed suit in the Southern District of New York on behalf of Mahmoud Khalil and 7 other Columbia University students against Columbia University and the House Committee on Education and Workforce regarding the committee's attempt to force Columbia University to disclose potentially thousands of student records. This effort is part of an escalation of existing attacks on students who have been on the forefront of calling for justice in Palestine. We've already seen the unconstitutional arrest and detention of Mahmoud Khalil, and we aim through this suit to protect other Columbia students from such harmful abuse of power. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Amy Greer, who's an attorney with Dratel Lewis. Amy has been central to defending Columbia students in disciplinary proceedings for this last year.
Greetings, salam alaikum. My name is Amy Greer, as Lamia just said, and I have been working in the Columbia space for the last year, but more specifically over the last 6 or so months with a new office that came into being called the Office of Institutional Equity at Columbia. And this office is being used to suppress speech. I'm defending students and organizing with other attorneys to defend students facing these proceedings where students are not just found responsible potentially for conduct, but actually found responsible for discrimination and harassment for exercising their free speech rights and speaking on behalf of Palestine and Palestinians. And it is targeting primarily Palestinian students, Muslim students, South Asian students, students of color, first-generation students, the students who have been brave enough to lift their voices on behalf of Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, people living in southern Lebanon, and other people around the world. These are human rights defenders. They're defenders of Palestinian dignity and steadfastness, and they have been persistent in their organizing despite all of the pressure put on them by Columbia University. And Columbia is not a lone actor. We're here bringing this lawsuit because over the last 16 months, Congress has and other executive branch actors, et cetera, have exercised great power over our higher education institutions, including Columbia and Barnard, in order to get them to then pressure students to stop speaking. And I think it's because the movement's working, don't you? So what's been happening is the government has been calling on these universities to hand over individual student disciplinary records. And on February 13th, 2025, the Committee on Education and Workforce did this again, and that's what we're here to stop. But let me back up for a second. So last year, Congress sent letters to numerous universities around the country demanding these records. The records were turned over. And on October 31st, 2024, this committee turned out a report. It was called a report on anti-Semitism on campuses around the country. And in that report, students were named, faculty were named, students' identities, while their names were redacted, clear identifying information was available. And people identified these students and began a pervasive doxing campaign. And that campaign had already begun, students activating on anti-war activists, anti-genocide activists, Palestinian rights activists. They had been doxed already, that's not new to us. But after this report, students were experiencing even greater levels of doxing and online harassment. And I think that's because people felt free. If Congress is labeling these people as dissidents, as anti-Semites, as radicals, as all these things, it gives people permission to then go out and violate their privacy, to frighten them, to scare them. And all of this is a collective effort by the government, Columbia, and other actors, third-party actors affiliated with both, to make these students afraid to speak, to make them be afraid to gather together, to be seen together. For students who are Palestinian, they've been afraid to wear keffiyeh, even though that's traditional garb and a powerful symbol of identity. They've been afraid, Mahmoud himself was afraid to walk places with his wife for fear that she would be identified and that she would also experience online harassment and doxing. And this is what Congress has done in its use of what's called the jawbone tactic. It is trying to suppress, it is trying to chill our students and our own rights to speech, to expression, and to association. We have the right to gather with our friends, our families, our community members, our neighbors, our campus colleagues, our fellow students, in order to speak out against war, to speak out against our country's policies, to speak out against other countries' policies. We have those rights in this country, and Congress is trying to use private actors in order to suppress those rights, and they cannot do that. Congress obviously can't do it directly because we have the First Amendment. So they're trying to pressure and coerce these third parties to do it for them, to do their dirty work. They're hiring a hitman. And this lawsuit is to say to them, they cannot do that. And this lawsuit is to say to Columbia that it must not comply. It's time for Columbia to stand up for its students, and it's time for Congress to respect our students' First Amendment rights. Thank you.
Gadir Abbas with the Council on American Islamic Relations. This lawsuit challenges the House Committee's illegal efforts to get disciplinary records, but it also challenges Columbia University's willingness to become an appendage of the government and get these disciplinary records that will, if provided and left unchallenged, result in other students across the country and in this city being vilified and, in fact, being subject to deportation. And colleges and universities need to decide, do they want their students cowering in fear in their dorms, afraid to leave because an ICE agent might pick them up because of a protest that they attended last year or earlier this semester? Is that the campus environment that colleges and universities want? Students, families, they're watching what these campus officials are going to do. And those campus officials are much better off following the First Amendment. Because if you're going to do the bidding of the federal government, then the First Amendment applies to you too. Thank you.
Good morning, Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. My name's Afaf Nasher. I'm the Executive Director for CAIR-NY. As you heard, we're here on behalf of 8 plaintiffs. And these 8 plaintiffs are seeking protections from an unconstitutional, un-American assault on our most basic of freedoms, our freedom of speech and our freedom to assemble. And it's with a lot of sadness and much dismay that we even have to be here today at all to announce this lawsuit. As Americans, we're known for the ability to speak and protest openly, whether it's about our elected officials, about our own nation, and about any other nation, with no exceptions. This blind allegiance we have to a foreign country, namely Israel, should never undermine our freedoms as Americans. Because it's this very freedom to speak and protest that has inspired the very birth of this nation and has made us a role model for all democracies that followed. That is why we choose to end this press conference with a warning and reminder for all Americans. Regardless of what your viewpoints are on any subject matter, domestic or international, your liberties are at stake. allowing Congress and institutions like Columbia and others to target you or someone else because of a viewpoint you hold is an epic danger to American values. Today, it's these students who are being targeted. Today, we represent these students, but tomorrow it can be you for the viewpoint you hold, whether it's this administration or a future administration that wants to suppress your voice. It's our freedom, and we are at a crossroads. Americans need to decide whether we believe our freedoms are still the values that we cherish and are still worth defending. We ask students, parents, and Americans of all backgrounds and political viewpoints to stand united in the effort to preserve freedom of speech and freedom to assemble. We also remind our institutions, our students, and our activists not to allow this silencing tactic, not to allow this fear tactic to suppress your activity, because we are stronger together. And we cannot allow people to divide us and to choose one target and then essentially topple over the entire domino line. This is more than just about one student. And we will stand as CAIR-New York, as individual attorneys, as individual law firms for the right to defend our freedom of speech and freedom to assemble. And we know that our strong activists, students, families, and Americans across the nation will do the same. We'll now open up to questions. So if you have any, please address our attorneys. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Lisa Rosner from CBS. My question is about how is this impacting protesting on campus? I saw an article that said CAIR-Ohio told students who are here on visas not to come out because he was worried for their safety. I'm wondering if you as CAIR-New York have given any similar directives. And my other question is just about when it comes to free speech, like some lawyers have said, when you go into a building and you sit there and you don't allow people to come through and go to class, that this is like another level. Can you talk about whether that's also, you know, something that, are you telling students anything about that, to, like giving directives on how they share their viewpoints?
With regards to CAIR in general, and then CAIR New York, Lemia, you can speak to what we've been telling CAIR New York folks. CAIR in general.
This has had an immediate impact on the willingness of students and other folks to gather on campus and elsewhere, because the worst fears have been realized. This is Marco Rubio and Donald Trump sitting around a room saying, let's deport this guy. That's the process that they used to pick Mahmoud Khalil. And there's a groundwork that's been laid over the past year. They've been gathering disciplinary records from all across the country. And so the ingredients are in place for a real unprecedented campaign, or if there is a precedent, you'd have the McCarthy hearings in the 50s. Yeah.
Lemia, in regards to instructions we've been giving students.
With respect to your question on non-citizen students, you know, as we've seen, the immigration system is being wielded in an excessively unconstitutional manner. And so ultimately our priority is making sure that students can protect their livelihoods while they're able to speak freely. These two things should not be pitted against each other, but we're seeing this being tested now. And so our advice to non-citizen students has been consult with an immigration attorney and know your risks. That's ultimately, it's going to be different for each student. These two abilities to be in the US and protest, again, should not be at odds, but here we are, eyes wide open, seeing exactly what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think it's fair to expect the worst. In 2017, when the Trump administration initiated its first Muslim ban, it applied explicitly to green card holders, but within days, confronted with the revulsion of basically an entire nation, they backed off of that, and the subsequent versions of the Muslim ban never again tried to target green card holders. And so it was up in the air whether the Trump administration was going to follow the model that they did the last go around or do something different. And I think Mahmoud Khalil's abduction is an indication that they've decided to take a dangerous authority and escalate it. Yeah, so so we're expecting a broad Muslim ban, irrational, animus-fueled restrictions on immigration from a host of Muslim-majority nations.
Amy will add.
Yeah.
I was just going to actually answer about the occupation and questions about being in spaces and the First Amendment. So while these campuses, while we are talking about these campuses in some ways as being an arm of the government, they also have their own rules. And the students have, over time, asked the administration to engage with them in negotiations, in conversations. And when over time things escalate, and I don't mean escalation I just mean in activism and movement tactics and strategies, in order to get somebody to come to the table, there are tactics that are used. For the most part, many of those tactics are still protected under the First Amendment. However, many students have been entering buildings that they have a student pass, a right to be in. And I think universities have an opportunity to engage with their students instead of bringing in law enforcement onto their campus in order to suppress activism and in order to suppress speech. So, admittedly, as a criminal defense attorney, there is a fine line. You're asking a decent question. There is a fine line. There's no question there. But at the same time, in some ways, these are still private entities. They do still get to decide how they engage with their students. And as I've heard from so many students, they go into their classrooms and they're learning about movement tactics. They're learning about the 1960s and all the organizing. They're learning about the civil rights movement. We just had the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, Bloody Monday. In this country, Bloody Sunday is Ireland. Sorry, wrong reference, but the Pettus Bridge, et cetera. And so students are learning these things in the classroom as a historical reference. And then when they go out and actually utilize those tactics in order to in their eyes, prevent a genocide or take an anti-war perspective or climate perspective. I mean, the thing is, what's happening at Columbia right now regarding what's happening in Gaza in the West Bank is part of a long history of student activism around Black liberation, around divesting from South Africa, from apartheid South Africa, and they're building on those traditions. And so there's a strong First Amendment protection to a lot of that action, and also these private institutions have an opportunity to choose not to exercise criminal law in that way, and to actually engage with their students and engage in productive dialogue, and they have persistently chosen not to do that. So I've been working at Columbia, I actually started on a Barnard case, and then a bunch of the Columbia cases came through. I've worked on encampment cases, and I've also worked on cases in front of the University Judicial Board, as well as cases in front of the Office of Institutional Equity, which was just developed over last summer, and I'm pretty convinced that that's also a response to congressional pressure, the development of that office. What I'm hearing from students is a mixture, right? And something we have to remember, most of the people that I work with and talk to at Columbia are between 18 and 24 years old, okay? They've been brutalized by police that have been brought onto their campus. They've been sprayed with some kind of chemical. They've been doxxed persistently, including by some of their professors and faculty members. Their administrators have been pulling them into offices to speak with them alone, separate from everybody, asking for names and to identify each other. They have been suspended. They've had transcripts held. They've been labeled all kinds of things that I'm sure you've seen all over the news. They're 18 to 24-year-old in movement together, standing against a war or a genocide, depending on your perspective. I take the perspective of it's a genocide from a legal perspective as well as a human one. And these students are simultaneously terrified and undeterred. And that's because they're in community with each other. They take care of each other. When students who are, as Lamia referenced, when students are unsure about what their immigration status could mean because of their, their activism in immigration status, and they're too afraid to leave their house, people are bringing them food. People are making sure that they are connected to the outside world. When students are being terribly doxxed and people are following them and putting cameras in their faces, students walk together in groups to protect each other. And they keep showing up anyway. And so I would say they're angry, they feel betrayed. I think they are disillusioned deeply by an institution that they went to because of its history, particularly in 1968, and because of its incredible history around divestment from apartheid South Africa. And so they feel like they've been betrayed by their institution that they chose to go to because of its activist history. They feel betrayed because they were selected to attend here in large part because of the very identities they're being punished for having now. They're scared, terrified. I have students calling me in panic attacks. There have been multiple attempts on their own lives as students have been wrapped up in criminal cases and disciplinary cases, mental health crises, and yet they keep showing up. So there is a profound solidarity and fortitude and steadfastness that these students have, because for many of them, it is their own people who are being harmed. It is people who look like them who are being harmed, people who practice the same religion that they do who are being harmed, friends, family members who are being harmed. In some cases, it's the students' religion being weaponized against others, and who are standing up as Jewish students on campus saying this does not represent me, who are also being slapped down. So these students, this is what I'm hearing. This is what I'm hearing from them. And one of the most common questions that I hear over and over again is, why are they doing this to us? We're standing for peace. We're standing for justice. Why is this happening?
I just want to add, while there is a focus on Columbia, this is not just Columbia. This is institutions across the state that at least CAIR-New York has been involved with students who are facing disciplinary hearings, expulsion, institutions that are withholding diplomas despite the fact that students have worked hard for a number of years to earn that diploma. And what we have seen time and time again is while people of color, Muslims, Palestinians, and Arabs and South Asians have been primary targets, this is a cross-cultural, cross-faith, cross-citizenship status movement. And so we have people of all faiths. And if you look back at Columbia and the twisted narrative that some are trying to weaponize, it's simply a falsehood, because you had students of all different faiths who were connecting, peacefully assembling, and again, fighting for something that is just and fighting for peace for everyone. And those same students are taking that courage and continuously putting themselves at risk. And it's incumbent upon us as organizations, as lawyers, as law firms, to then stand in solidarity with them and say, there's still recourse, and that we will challenge the government and institutions whenever they try to make our student activists and Americans who choose to protest vulnerable as targets. Next question.
Columbia recently announced some. Thank you.
Thank you.
Columbia recently announced new procedures around doxing. Do you think that's sufficient to protect students?
Does anyone know?
No.
Okay.
Can you elaborate?
In order Colombia can put out all the policies that it wants, but unless and until those policies are matched with actions, I don't see how those policies matter. Some of you may have seen the Prem Thakur article that came out. I don't even know what day it is anymore, but recently, and about Mahmoud's email to Colombia. I think Mahmoud is a prime example of how I was privy to emails where he was sent those policies. And we have a catalog of the doxing and harassment that he experienced online, and I know he experienced like physically in person as well. And it included tweets from very prominent voices, prominent organizations, tagging him and his photograph and information about him with Marco Rubio, with President Trump, with ICE, with DHS, with all of these, people. And the request has always been, can you help us figure out how to take these down? Can you speak on our behalf? Can you help us navigate all of this? And, handing a student a bunch of policies doesn't do that. And also, again, I have to, and this is not true of Mahmoud specifically, this is true of a lot of the other students who are going through really profound doxing and having horrific things said to them. Like, some of these students are very young and they're freaking out. And so to hand somebody a policy and say, this will help you deal with being threatened with sexual violence, for example, as opposed to actually offering assistance and care, it's just not sufficient. So, no.
And then my other question is just, the university has taken a stance on anti-Semitism, but hasn't taken a super clear stance on Islamophobia. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think what policies would make students feel safer on campus?
Are you comfortable talking about that? Okay. I'll let you talk about that. But I just wanted to add to your first question, the level of hypocrisy that exists with these institutions, even in pushing out a policy, when on the other end, they're willing to supply names and allow ICE agents on campus, right? It's this facade of trying to do anything for students when you're inviting NYPD's SRG to abuse students in your own buildings and on your own campus. So we can never really say these campuses are trying in any way to protect these students when they are opening up the gates of hell for these students with their own hands. Okay, do you want to go to the Islamophobia?
With respect to Colombia's stance on Islamophobia, all indications that I've seen about the rhetoric they're using to punish students, to me, demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of Islam, of its Muslim students, and the values that it proposes. They may have policies written on their anti-discrimination policies. They are bound by those. But as Amy said, policies don't get you very far if Colombia does not act in line with them or doesn't actually show up for its Muslim students. So no.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question on international students. Do you have any travel advisory or ways that students from these communities can protect themselves if they plan on traveling and so on? Yeah.
Yeah, our advice for if you're on a student visa is to not leave the country right now. That's our advice. Because we expect visa restrictions to come online at some point in the coming weeks, and we can see that the Trump administration intends to abuse its authority, whatever it interprets as its authority, and so we expect a mess, and I think the Trump administration is promising one. Yeah.
So the advisory is regardless of the country of origin of these students, just in general, it's advised not to.
Well, when we communicate, we're communicating with our community as Muslims. So the students that are coming here are either that we've given that advice to are either Muslims themselves or they're from Muslim majority countries. And so we don't know what the final list will be or what the restrictions are. There were a lot of variations in it. And so if you can avoid it, our advice is to let's see what the restrictions are, and then that way you can make an informed decision about travel plans.
Thank you.
We're also starting to hear additional reports that at entry at the airports, there has been heightened scrutiny, not just of green card holders from these potential list of countries on the travel ban, but from any country about their political activism, about their advocacy in support of Palestine. We've seen U.S. citizens have this kind of questioning as well. This is not limited to that, but the harm and risk for non-citizen folks traveling regardless, especially if you're an activist right now, is significant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jay Dow from WPIX. Universities and campuses have long been bastions of free speech, of dialogue, of back and forth, finding yourself, finding your position. I'd like to know your opinion on the long-term impact on students willing to find themselves and their positions in light of what has been happening with the Trump administration and the university's reactions to these policies.
I think that's a great question because obviously we're here for a specific for students who have been facing disciplinary proceedings for their activism for Palestinian dignity and human rights and to stop the genocide. But I think what you're asking is also really powerful to broader issues as well, which my colleagues here have pointed to, which is I think anybody standing up for Palestinian liberation for all, I might add and clarify, is what Palestinian liberation stands for, and has always been a canary in the coal mine for speech and for national security policy, meaning that however our government frequently reacts in a certain way to lifting up Palestinian voices through like material support laws and also through suppressing various kinds of speech. And I think it's no different here, right? And so I point that out to say that we're also seeing universities, including Columbia actually, as soon as that anti-DEI executive order went out, Columbia immediately took everything off its site. Like people hadn't even filed a lawsuit yet, which the judge actually granted a temporary restraining order on. And so I think these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on student activism, on any number of topics, not just Palestine, but the environment, climate, the suppression of all of this speech, I think, is having a chilling effect on students feeling like there's something to be gained by going to university. Students go to school, to your point, to meet new people, to get exposure to new ideas, maybe study abroad and see different parts of the world if they're privileged and able to do that. And I do think that these systematic attacks that did not just start 16 months ago, but have been long in the making, and I think this very enterprising, and I don't mean that in a complimentary way, administration has just been expediting what's already been in process for a long time, which is rolling back those college spaces as places where people can cultivate new ideas, envision what a world could look like, not what it does look like, envision alternatives, get curious with each other, meet people from walks of life that they never would have had the opportunity to meet otherwise. And I do think that students and young people in general are going to start wondering, what do I have to gain for going here? I can learn practical skills elsewhere, but if I can't come here to get curious, to explore new ideas, to really expand my mind, to look at the world in a new way, to envision a different future, then what's the point? So I think there's a real concern there about what universities will end up being more like career technical schools instead of places of intellectual inquiry and rigor.
Any other questions? Okay. So So thank you. We appreciate everybody's presence. We'll hang out for just a little bit if anybody does want to talk on the side, but we appreciate your presence, and we really hope that you guys bring this story and the voices out of those that are being targeted in this way.